everyone, this is Marbella from NETIC. Thanks to everybody for joining us and welcome to tonight's webinar. Just a reminder to let everybody know that if you have any issues with sound or video, it's helpful to close the window and rejoin the conversation. Also, there's a little chat box, as some of you have noticed. Thanks for everyone for introducing themselves and for joining us. If you have any issues, I'll be watching the webinar also, so I can try to troubleshoot them for you. We'll have the recording and the slides available at the end of the webinar, and we'll send that out to all of the registrants. That'll also be found at netic.ca, our website, where you can find all other information as well. So NETIC and I are really, really excited to be presenting tonight's webinar, Improving Eating Disorder Prevention, Adolescents and Young Women's Health. And we have two wonderful presenters here with us tonight, Dr. Jennifer Mills and Shasha Tse. I said it right. Dr. Jennifer Mills is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at York University. She conducts research on body image and eating disorders and has received research funding from Women's College Hospital, SSHRC, and the Canada Foundation for Innovation. She's a registered psychologist and has a part-time private practice in Toronto, where she treats clients with eating and associated disorders. Shasha Tse is a student in the Counseling and Clinical Psychology program from OISE at the University of Toronto, and her research interests include body image, eating disorders, and substance abuse. So welcome everybody, and I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer and Shasha.
Great, thank you very much. Switch to the next slide.
Yeah, so what you can do is...
Oh, okay, great, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much to NETIC for hosting this webinar tonight. We are really excited to be here and to share with you some of the recent research from my lab on eating disorder prevention and participants' opinions of common prevention themes. And we'll also talk about eating disorder prevention in more general terms to give people a sense of where the field is at right now. So just before we get further into the presentation, I wanted to give a very quick overview of the definitions of the eating disorders, just to make sure that So as you can see on this slide, the main eating disorders are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. Anorexia nervosa is characterized by persistent behaviors that interfere with maintaining an adequate weight for health. So these individuals are medically underweight, and there's also a powerful fear of gaining weight or becoming fat. There's often a disturbance in how the person experiences their weight and shape, and the person does not fully appreciate the seriousness of the condition. And anorexia nervosa is a very serious medical disorder and is linked with cardiac arrest, suicidality, and other causes. Bulimia nervosa is characterized by recurring episodes of food restriction followed by binge eating. And there are also recurrent behaviors that follow the binge eating, which are meant to compensate for the extra food that's taken in during the binge and to prevent weight gain. The person tends to negatively evaluate their shape and weight and feels that these matter more than just about anything else. So there's very, very high weight and shape related self-evaluation. And then finally, binge eating disorder is the most recent official eating disorder diagnosis. Binge eating disorder is characterized by recurrent episodes of binge eating, like in bulimia nervosa, but there are no compensatory or purging behaviors. And for those who aren't familiar with the term binge eating, a binge eating episode is one in which the person eats an unusually large amount of food during a relatively short period of time and feels out of control about what they've eaten, feels distressed about the eating, and eats regardless of their hunger cues, even if they feel uncomfortably full. Eating alone in binges is common due to embarrassment and feelings of shame or guilt or disgust afterwards are very common. Now, of course, people don't always fit nice and neatly into these formal diagnoses, and these are really meant to be guides. Okay, so most people with serious disordered eating might receive instead a diagnosis of OSSED, which stands for an other specified feeding or eating disorder. So they might show most of the signs of anorexia nervosa, but there might be a diagnostic criterion that they don't fit. So that's important to know. And those individuals are recognized as having significant disordered eating. And the other thing that's important to remember is that people can shift from one diagnosis to another in the course of having an eating disorder. So an individual who starts off with anorexia nervosa might then go on to show signs of bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder. 20% of women suffer from some type of an eating disorder. So the way that I put it is that eating disorders are not normal, but they are common. And they're most common in people aged 14 to 25, although there's a wide range of ages of individuals who are affected by the eating disorders. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate out of any mental illness, particularly anorexia nervosa. About 15% of people who are diagnosed with anorexia nervosa die from the illness, including all causes of death associated with that illness. And you might have noticed that I've referred to eating disorders in the female pronoun. Approximately 90% of eating disorder cases are female, but men are probably underreported in the literature. So that's because of differences in men seeking help for their eating, and also because, in part, weight control behaviors in men can be different than they are in women. Men might, for instance, be less likely to diet and more likely to try to bulk up through weightlifting and that sort of thing. The take-home message is that eating disorders, regardless of the type of diagnosis, can have a devastating effect on the individual and on his or her family. Eating disorders are also very expensive and difficult to treat, and anorexia nervosa in particular is considered to be a chronically relapsing disorder. And so because of that, prevention efforts are essential to minimize the harm and severity of eating disorders. One thing that's common between all of these eating disorders is a core emotional feature, and that is extreme concern for weight and shape. And that's really the core feature that most prevention studies typically target, and what we'll be talking about tonight. Again, that extreme concern for weight or shape. All right, and on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter tonight, Shasha Tse, and she's going to talk about some of the known causes of eating disorders.
Hello everyone, my name is Shasha, and I'll be presenting on this slide and then a little bit later on my perspective. So there are various disorders, and there are various predisposing factors that make women exposed to eating disorders. Some of these factors involve like genetics, such as you'll find that some of these predisposing factors involve genetic factors and social cultural factors, family factors, and individual factors. So for instance, you'll find that among siblings, they might share some genetics that make them more prone to eating disorders as opposed to individuals that are not siblings, for instance. As well as in terms of social cultural factors, you'll find that the mass media, for instance, portrays this ideal body shape for women to be thin and slender. And especially women who are not critical in terms of evaluating the media, they might be more prone to eating disorders. In terms of family factors, you'll find that individuals with eating disorders, their family might be more focused on success and perfectionism, for instance, which can make individuals more prone to developing eating disorders. As for individual factors, you might find that individuals with eating disorders have low self-esteem and are often perfectionists as well. In terms of the precipitating factors, you'll find that sometimes individuals with eating disorders or prone to eating disorders might use quantity of food or restricting as a way of coping with stress. In terms of dieting, individuals that do yo-yo dieting might be prone to eating disorders because the metabolism after dieting might slow down, and this will might cause them to diet even more, which could get out of control and develop into an eating disorder. As for weight gain or loss, sometimes individuals that want to lose a lot of weight, they might restrict a lot, and this can get carried away into an eating disorder. Or and individuals who binge a lot might also develop an eating disorder as well. In terms of puberty, you might find that young women's bodies change a lot, and you might find that they might be more prone to weight gain, which can also make them more susceptible in terms of developing an eating disorders. And in terms of instructions, peers might influence each other in terms of giving some dieting instructions on how to lose weight, which could develop as well into an eating disorder.
Okay. All right, so now I'll turn to talking about eating disorder prevention more specifically. So here's some examples on this slide of larger scale eating disorder prevention projects that currently exist. And the program that is the most widespread in the United States is called the Body Project. It's usually conducted through sororities across college campuses in the U.S. The primary target is young women, and it aims to educate women about how to improve body image and discourage body dissatisfaction. Another one to know about is STRIPE, the Strategic Training Initiative for the Prevention of Eating Disorders. So this was launched in 2009. It's based at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health as well as Boston Children's Hospital. And what they do there, among other things, is they train professionals to have the expertise and skills needed to prevent eating disorders. And one of their most important mandates is to bring about large-scale shifts towards prioritizing policy translation. And I'll talk a little bit more about policy in the next slide as well. Another project to be aware of that is closer to home and is fantastic is the Ontario Community Outreach Program for Eating Disorders. For the past 20 years or so, Gail McVeigh and her colleagues have designed, implemented, and evaluated a series of prevention programs that are aimed at children, youth, and young adults, as well as adults who are in contact with young people, so teachers and coaches and educators. So this organization has a comprehensive strategy to help to prevent eating disorders. It's supported by the Government of Ontario, and they do everything from policy development, advocacy, organizing, and training for practitioners across the province. So reading from their own guidelines for prevention, this is what the Ontario Community Outreach Program has to say about prevention. So I'm quoting here, the current research indicates that teaching students about eating disorders is ineffective in changing their eating attitudes and behaviors. Moreover, this approach may be harmful since some students might learn to glamorize disturbed eating behavior. So instead, schools are encouraged to adopt school-wide approaches that encompass sensitivity training to educators and parents, that raise their awareness about the role that they play in influencing children's body image, how we can recognize and act on incidences of weight discrimination, media literacy, school policies that address teasing and bullying, and opportunities for physical activity of children of all sizes and shapes. So you can go to their website for more information, but it's really a wonderful organization that is doing great work. And then last but certainly not least, I wanted to put in a big plug today for the Beyond Images program. So Beyond Images is a free self-esteem and body image curriculum, and it was created for grades 4 to 8. It's a 20-lesson curriculum that you can access. And if you access it, you get everything from online lesson plans on media literacy to tip sheets, student worksheets, and best of all, it's free. So this is a great place for people to start if you're working with children who fit into that age group. And if you want to be doing something in the classroom or in an educational setting that would help children to better navigate some of the media images that they come across and positively affect their self-esteem and body image. So you can find more information about Beyond Images on the NEDIC website under their prevention tab. So before I get into the details of our research project, I thought that I would give you the lay of the land when it comes to eating disorder prevention. And so I wanted to present some ideas that could be considered current issues or controversies in the field. So very early on in the academic prevention literature, there were a couple of studies done which suggested that teaching young women and girls about eating disorders might in fact make things worse and amplify their risk factors. In other words, they might teach people how to be eating disorders. And this is one of the reasons why prevention now does not teach very young women and men what the eating disorders involve in terms of the specific symptoms and in terms of problematic behavior. So we know now that this is a myth. Eating disorder prevention doesn't necessarily make things worse, but we do have to be really cautious and careful in the content that we deliver to young people. Another issue is that we definitely need to be more inclusive, both in the prevention and treatment of eating disorders. So men and members of the LGBTQ2 community are too often neglected, and that creates a critical gap in the literature that unfortunately we just need more. We need more research, we need more information to fill that gap and to figure out how we can best serve people of all genders. Another issue is whether to focus on the individual or society. This is kind of an interesting point that I was reflecting on in preparation for today. We're talking about prevention programs that typically target the individual. You know, how can we get an individual to feel better about him or herself and have a more positive body image? But another way of looking at it is that those individual factors like self-esteem and personality are just one piece of the puzzle around the origins of eating disorders. And there are some who argue that the burden of change really should not be on the individual, but on a society that glamorizes thinness or stigmatizes larger body sizes, or basically creates an environment where disordered eating can thrive. So I put that out there as something to think about, that we have to be careful not to place too much of the burden on the individual. Related to that point is public policy and how we can try to bring about larger scale changes to the culture in which we live, a culture that too often makes it too easy for people to go on to develop disordered eating. And we have something in Canada that you may or may not be aware of that was brought forward by the Minister of Culture, Communications and the Status of Women a few years ago in Quebec. And this is called La Chic. And the goal of this Quebec Charter is to incite organizations and people to pledge to promote diversity of body images, to encourage healthy eating, to discourage excessive weight control and dieting practices. So it's a charter that seeks to create this kind of cross-disciplinary cooperation between different levels of society. And there's some early emerging research by Howard Steiger and others that have looked at how this Quebec Charter, La Chic, has changed attitudes. And the results seem to be encouraging that, after the introduction of this charter, we've seen more positive attitudes toward these issues in the province of Quebec. And then finally, something to think about is the critique of eating disorder prevention programs, which is that reducing body dissatisfaction is fine and good, but that it won't affect eating disorder rates. And I'm not agreeing with this statement necessarily, but again, I'm putting it out there as something to think about. Eating disorders are very complex issues. We've seen and heard all of the different factors that go into the origin of an eating disorder. Body dissatisfaction is one piece of it, but it may not be the entire piece of it. And the thing about eating disorder prevention programs that do target body dissatisfaction is that everyone can benefit. Even if you're not on your way to developing an eating disorder, we can all benefit from having a positive body image and avoiding body dissatisfaction impeding our quality of life. So that brings me to the current study, which is a research project that I'll talk to you about today. So 2 years ago, I approached NETIC to see whether they would like to collaborate on a research project aimed at improving the effectiveness and impact of eating disorder prevention messages. So the findings to date had suggested that eating disorder prevention programs and projects are effective in combating the development of disordered eating. However, with that in mind, there are some weaknesses in that research. So one is that even when there are statistically significant positive outcomes of prevention studies, unfortunately the effect sizes are small. And what that means in real terms is that the programs may not have such a large or meaningful impact in the real world. Furthermore, the content of eating disorder programs vary. Now, there is overlap, of course, but they are different. And so there are actually very little empirical data as to which prevention messages or themes, in other words, are most effective in dissuading eating disorder behaviors and attitudes. And then finally, no study to date had ever examined the reactions of people with eating disorders to specific prevention messages. And on the one hand, these are individuals for whom they've already gone on to develop disordered eating. At the same time, these individuals have firsthand experience and may have really valuable insight into the appropriateness and the effectiveness of different prevention messages. So these were the research questions that we wanted to answer. We also wanted to look at ratings of the presenter, the person who's delivering the eating disorder messages. And we wanted to know what participants thought of that presenter and whether ratings of a presenter relate at all to ratings of message persuasiveness. So we got some funding from Women's College Hospital, and we got to work. So Shasha, who was my wonderful research assistant on the project and who was heavily involved in the data collection in the second phase of the study, is the person who will talk to you about the method in some detail now.
So in terms of the method of the study, so we basically collected data from 3 different sites, and as can be seen on this. Actually, I think it's a slide there. 3 sites. Okay, I'll just mention it. Okay, so in this study, we collected data from 3 different sites for our participants, and the 3 different sites was based on a convenience of locating these participants. So the first site was at York University in Toronto. We used the undergraduate research participant pool. The second site was from Vancouver Hospital. It was a young children and women's hospital, and this involved eating disorder patients. And the third site was from NETIC, which is we collected data from the community. We had 174 young women participate in the study, and they were between the ages of 13 and 24 years old. And in terms of how we screened and confirmed that some individuals had an eating disorder versus those that didn't have an eating disorder, for the eating disorder group, we basically had 2 main ways of screening for individuals with eating disorders. So the one group, which was the non-hospitalized participants, which came from the university and the community in Toronto, we basically gave them a clinical interview, which was called the mini, in order to screen for if they had an eating disorder in the present or in the past, as well as to see what type of eating disorder they had. For the hospitalized participants, we asked for consent for them to participate in our study, and also we asked for consent to access their file in order to determine what type of eating disorder they had presently. For the control group, which was the non-clinical sample, we had a specific question we asked them, and if they answered no to this question, we knew that they were in the control group or the non-clinical sample. So we asked, have you ever been diagnosed with or suspected that you had an eating disorder? And if they answered no to that, they would automatically be assigned to the non-clinical control group of the study. And a little bit of background information on the participant groups, the eating disorder clinical group and the non-clinical or the control group, those that didn't have an eating disorder. As you can see, the sample size for the eating disorder group was 60 participants. For the non-eating disorder group, non-clinical group, there was 113 participants. And as you can see from the age between the two groups, they were more or less the same. And in terms of the body mass index of the participants, you can see that it's a little lower for the eating disorder group compared to the non-eating disorder group, which is expected. All right. So in terms of the measures that we used or the materials that we used, we had eating disorder prevention messages that were presented in a video format. So we had different clips that we showed to them, which are different messages for the participants. So these messages involve things like about fat talk, conversations, and how that's dangerous in terms of making individuals susceptible to eating disorders and how to steer clear of that. Another second message that we presented involved social cultural pressures in terms of the media and how to critically evaluate the media. A third message involves looking at historical and cultural differences, such as some cultures you might find that the ideal body shape is thin and slender, whereas in other cultures you might find the cultural curvier body shape is more appropriate in that culture. But what we wanted to teach participants is to not define their ideal body shape based on these social cultural pressures, but to consider their own subjective ideal body shape is what we wanted to do in terms of those participants. Another message that we looked at is also trying to help participants not making any upward comparisons in terms of physical appearance and attractiveness. Like you might find girls might or women might look at someone that's maybe more slender than them, and then they will compare themselves with those women. So we try to discourage those women from doing that as well. And then in terms of the fifth theme, we basically wanted women to know that their value is not associated with how slender or attractive they are and how dangerous that is to make that association, because that kind of can make them more inclined to eating disorders. So we wanted to have them be aware of that as well. In terms of the remaining measures, there were different questionnaires other than the messages that we provided to participants. We had the following questionnaires. So the one was for them to rate the eating disorder messages. So we wanted to know how believable some of the messages were in terms of and the persuasiveness of the message. We also wanted them to rate the presenter of the video messages. So there was a Caucasian woman with brown hair and blue eyes that presented the video messages, and she was basically very she was very. We wanted them to focus more on the message instead of the person presenting the messages. So we had a very neutral background as well, and she spoke very energetically. Other measures we provided was a self-esteem measure as well as a mood measure. For the self-esteem and the mood measure, we wanted to present these two measures to participants like before we gave them the eating disorder prevention messages in order to measure their self-esteem and the mood just before they were exposed to these messages. And we also had a demographic questionnaire in which we asked questions about their age, their relationship status, as well as their body mass index was also calculated using the demographic questionnaire. Okay. Okay. All right. And since of the procedure of the study, so how did we, in what order did we do this using the different materials? So basically what we did is, like on the other slide, we mentioned there was the self-esteem and the mood questionnaire. So we presented them with these two questionnaires before being exposed to the video messages. Thereafter, we provided them with video messages, which was 5 different messages in random order, and each clip was about 2 to 3 minutes. Then right after they looked at each video clip, they would receive a questionnaire in terms of evaluating and providing their feedback on the messages in terms of their persuasiveness and believability. And then post watching these different clips in randomized order, then we'll present them with an evaluation questionnaire, which will involve rating the person that did present these messages in terms of her attractiveness and in terms of her body weight and shape, and then we'll present them with a demographic questionnaire.
All right, so Shasha already gave a good overview of the body dissatisfaction prevention messages. This is a recap of the 5 videos participants saw. So again, don't be fooled by the images, they are not real. Here's there the comparison trap, the ideal body shape and size change throughout history and culture, fat thoughts have negative consequences, and thinness does not determine how attractive or valuable you are. And again, we wanted to see ratings and opinions of these messages in terms of relevance, believability, emotional impact, and how they thought their behavior would change after seeing these messages. So here are some of the results. These are the participant characteristics here. All right, so these are the participant characteristics of the 2 groups. So the clinical group, again, had 60 participants. The non-clinical group had 113 participants in it. There were significant differences between the groups on all of these measures except for body mass index. The groups did significantly differ on age, and they significantly differed on their positive mood, negative mood, social performance, appearance, self-esteem, and total self-esteem. So in other words, compared to the non-clinical group, clinical participants were younger, had lower positive mood, higher negative mood, and lower self-esteem. Because age was unexpectedly different between the groups, that wasn't something that we were anticipating or, to be honest, really wanted to happen. What we did was we controlled for the effective age in the subsequent analyses. The reason for that, you can see the minimum age there in the clinical group was 13. We had several very young participants in the clinical group, so that brought down the average, and we had to adjust for that statistically. So what you're seeing here is a table showing the ratings of overall message persuasiveness across the group. So to get this variable of message persuasiveness, it's a combination of, again, relevance, believability, and emotional impact. And we found that the non-clinical group found the messages to be more persuasive. but all messages were seen as being equivalently persuasive. There were none that really stood out from the others. And I'll also remind you, these were rated on a 5-point scale, and the average was around, well, 3.5, closer to 4 for the non-clinical group. So the numbers are good, but to be honest, they're not great. There's still some room for improvement there in making these messages really persuasive to the participants. This table here shows the ratings of message facets, so getting down to the specifics of relevance, believability, and so forth. So both groups felt that the messages were equally relevant to them, about 3 out of 5 on the scale though, so not that high. That's one area in which maybe we can think about ways to improve eating disorder messages for young people, how to make them feel more relevant. The non-clinical group found the messages overall, across all of them, to be more believable, even after controlling for age. And there was an effective age. Young people found them to be not as believable as older participants. The non-clinical group rated all 5 messages as having a greater emotional impact on them than did the clinical group. And this was even after controlling for age, and age did have an effect. Younger people rated the messages as being less emotionally impactful as the older people in the sample. The last 2 dependent variables here, intention to diet and intention to compare, relating back to what Shasha was saying, those were 2 measures that we included in the ratings. So we wanted to know how participants felt they would be in terms of likelihood to change their behavior after looking at that video, or in this case, a combination of videos. So what's the likelihood that they would diet, and what's the likelihood that they would compare their bodies to some other people? And we found that the non-clinical group reported that their behavior was slightly likely to change afterwards as compared to the clinical group who said their behavior was not likely to change. And that was both for body comparison and dieting. So what that tells us is that the results show that people who are most at risk are the ones who are hardest to reach with the eating disorder prevention messages that we use. Women who are younger and women who are already showing signs of disordered eating are the ones that are really hard to reach. So it may be discouraging, but unfortunately it's not that surprising. I've also summarized some of the highlights around the results from the presenter rating. So you'll recall that we wanted to know participants' opinions of the presenter herself. This was the actress who appeared on video presenting the messages to the participants. So the clinical participants rated her as being less credible and heavier than the non-clinical group. And those differences were no longer significant once age was controlled for. So in other words, it's really carried by the effects of age. It's the younger participants who are being more critical and harsher of the presenter in their evaluations. They saw her as less attractive, less credible, and heavier than did the older participants. So then we decided, okay, well now we really want to look at how those messages of the rater relate to their messages, their opinions of the messages themselves. And interestingly, the more attractive and credible and thinner the participants found the presenter, the more persuasive they found the messages that she delivered. In other words, their opinion of the presenter or the source of the message does make a difference in terms of how persuaded they are by the messages. So really interesting effect there, I think. And this also relates to the next point, which is both groups reported a preference for a female presenter who has herself recovered from an eating disorder. And this is something that we hear from patients in treatment, that they're often quite enthusiastic about the idea of hearing from someone who has recovered from an eating disorder. It's someone that they see as being highly credible, very relevant to them, and it just makes much more of an impact than them being lectured to by someone that they feel that they might not have a lot in common with. All right, so let Shasha go over some of the additional comments that we got from participants in the study.
When I was administering some of these clinical interviews and speaking to some of these individuals that showed signs of eating disorders, some of them provided these additional comments to me while I was doing the clinical interview. Like some of them mentioned that definitely age matters. Um, and they mentioned that some of them wish that they would have received some of these eating prevention messages at a younger age. Not all of them obtained eating disorder prevention messages when they were younger, and they wish they obtained these messages because some haven't even been exposed to these messages before. Some found the messages really helpful in terms of the study that we did, and then also some mentioned how important family factors play in terms of eating disorders. I had one participant noted that she was teased by her family for her weight and her shape, which predisposed her to developing an eating disorder as well. Consistent with the origins of eating disorders and the causes of eating disorder, one participant mentioned that when she was really stressed out, her parents were going through a divorce, and because of all the stress, this made her more inclined to binge and more triggered her eating disorder more so. Another important factor is that one participant, she was a professional kickboxer, and she mentioned that one thing that eating disorder messages to take into consideration is the various ideal body shapes in sports. So in sports, there might be some sports that require thin, slender body shapes, such as gymnastics or dance. But then in other sports, such as kickboxing, a more muscular body shape is required for women as well. So that's very important to consider the various sports types and what ideal body shape is required. And then some participants mentioned about how they were teased in school for being overweight and how that caused them to go on diets and which in the end caused them to develop an eating disorder. So it's very important to take into account kids being bullied in school for their weight and their shape as well in eating disorder messages.
All right, so I thought that it might be nice to end on a positive, hopeful note. And I often get asked by parents and other people who work with young women in particular how they can help, what they can do to try to themselves prevent the onset or the severity of disordered eating. So I will encourage everyone listening to check out the NETIC website for excellent tips and specific strategies for classroom settings and coaching settings. The NETIC website has lots of good information and very specific strategies, but I'll highlight some of the ones that I think are really pertinent here. The first thing to do is to model healthy behaviors for children. We know that this makes a huge difference. By modeling healthy behaviors, unfortunately, some people think that that means modeling excessively healthy behaviors, but really what we're talking about is moderation. So healthy behaviors for children include, eating a piece of cake in front of your child. Not the whole cake, but a piece of cake. And commenting about how enjoyable it is to eat, rather than expressing feelings of guilt around eating. So just be mindful of that bias there, that when we talk about healthy behaviors, we're not talking about low-calorie or anti-fat behaviors. We're talking about everything in moderation. Another thing for people to remember is to provide an environment that makes it easy to make healthy choices. This is something, again, that would be interesting to think about policy translation for this. But, there's governments, particularly in the United States, are taking steps toward limiting the size of soft drinks and that sort of thing. Most schools in the Toronto District School Board encourage children to eat healthy snacks. But we could probably do an even better job at this sort of thing. And just to give you an example, I spent last year living in Australia, where two of my children attended public school, and it was the school's policy for the children to have a nutrition break in the morning. And this was across the state in Australia, South Australia, and the children had to bring fruit or vegetables. And the class broke at a specified time, and the children were given 5 to 10 minutes to take out their snack of fruit and vegetables, and it had to be fruit and vegetables. And so it provides an environment that makes it easy to make healthy choices because, as we all know, these things can just sometimes take practice so that we learn good habits of doing things and then those habits become automatic. Focusing less on weight and more on behaviors and overall health. This is a really big one. Jenny O'Day, also in Australia, has talked about this as well and how really unnecessary it is for us to put so much of an emphasis on weight. You know, weighing children when they go to the doctor as if that's an indication of their health, when really what we should be paying attention to are the behaviors and their overall physical fitness and their ability to be active and to engage in activities that make them feel good. And then finally providing a supportive environment with lots of listening and less talking. I think this actually jives nicely with the results of the study that I've talked about tonight too, which is that young people don't like to be lectured to. They don't like to be told something by someone that they feel isn't necessarily very credible. And that information is less likely to sink in. So we have to make sure that we're listening first and foremost, asking questions, listening closely to the answers, and really trying to tune into what our children are telling us. Sometimes they may be looking for reassurance. Sometimes they might be looking for advice. And we have to try to match our response as closely as possible to what they need. And finally, we welcome input regarding eating disorder prevention from members of the community, including everyone listening tonight, educators and professionals and young people, people with lived experiences with an eating disorder. If you have any ideas on how eating disorder prevention can and should be improved, please let me know. And likewise, if you have any specific comments or questions about anything from tonight's presentation, I'm happy to respond to emails, and you can find my email address here on this slide. I'd like to acknowledge the support of NEDIC, the National Eating Disorder Information Center, also Nicole Vu, a former graduate student of mine, and Dr. Ron Manley in Vancouver, who were involved in the first phase of the study and data collection in Vancouver. All of the women in the study who participated and shared their opinions, and the research funding agency. So Women's College Hospital provided money for this project, as well as the Canada Foundation for Innovation. All right, thank you very much for listening.
Okay, we have a couple of questions from people who joined us online. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the first question that we have was about the statistics from the beginning of the presentation of 20% of women have diagnosed with eating disorders, and they want to know if this is in Canada or where.
Yeah, so the numbers are similar, whether you're looking at Canada or the United States or really any Western country. I will qualify my answer somewhat by saying that it's still an estimate. When we do large-scale epidemiological studies, we're limited in the number of questions that are asked to participants. And that includes all of the eating disorder diagnoses that I mentioned. So the prevalence rates for anorexia nervosa are the lowest. Those are 1 to 2%, bulimia nervosa, 5 to 10%, binge eating disorder, about the same, and then the rest might be made up of that otherwise specified feeding and eating disorders. If you take all of those together, then we arrive at the statistic that's valid for Canada, which is about 1 in 5 women.
Sure, yeah. And we also received a few questions from the registration forms. And so one of the questions is, what is the success rate for people to try to beat an eating disorder on their
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't know is my best answer. We don't really know success rates. It really depends on the type of diagnosis that the person has received, so whether it's anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder. In general, anorexia nervosa has the lowest success rate, and as I mentioned in the presentation, anorexia can be considered a chronically relapsing disorder. However, having said that, there are people who recover fully from that. I think that the take-home message that I would want to convey is that treatment helps. Treatment does make a difference. The earlier that people can get into treatment, the better the outcomes. And the longer that they can stay symptom-free, the lower the chances of relapsing. So in other words, once people have gotten to the point where their behaviors or their symptoms are stable and they're not engaging in problematic behaviors, the longer they can stay like that, the lower the chance of a future relapse. So that's probably the best answer that I can give you. It depends on so many different factors, and ultimately a match between the person and what he or she needs and the treatment that's available. So do seek treatment. Try to find a setting that fits with what you want and what you need. And the earlier you get into treatment, the better.
Okay, I think we'll just do one more question. So this question is, my daughter is a 10-year-old competitive gymnast. How can I encourage positive image when she's getting other messages?
So as Shasha was saying, one of those sports environments, extracurricular environments can put a lot of pressure on young people. The idea that you have to have a certain type of body to do well at a particular sport or to do well at a particular activity. Um, so I would speak to my daughter in this hypothetical situation. I would want to talk to my daughter about what messages she's receiving. So try to find out what she's finding out from teammates, for instance. Um, there's often a lot of misinformation that travels among circles of young people, misinformation or misconceptions about nutrition. Um, so just to throw out an example, some girls think that they should avoid dairy products, that dairy isn't necessary, when actually that's not at all the truth. That's not at all the case. Girls need lots of calcium in their diet, and a great source of calcium is from dairy. So I would want to know what the messages are and do my best to try to correct any misinformation, and also ask questions about how she's feeling about the pressure that may be putting on her and how she feels she wants to react to that. Um, and I'll also just suggest not to ever be afraid to express concern about a loved one's eating. A lot of times I think parents feel so uncomfortable and so scared and concerned that they don't want to talk about it because they're afraid that they're going to upset their daughter or the person that they're concerned about. In my clinical experience, a lot of patients talk about how they wish someone had said something. And the fact that nobody did say anything kind of gave them this implicit permission to keep engaging in whatever they were doing. So if you notice something that doesn't seem quite right, if you notice weight loss or unusual behaviors, behaviors that seem exceedingly focused around weight and shape, don't hesitate to talk to the person about it. It's unlikely that you're going to make things worse by talking to them about it, but it's a fear that a lot of people have. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Shasha?
Well, the only thing I would add is that it's so important that parents provide the emotional support to the children, and also how she defines herself in terms of her value is so important. And it's more than just how she looks that's important. Uh, yeah, and that's
I'd like to thank Jennifer and Shasha for being our wonderful presenters for tonight, and also thank you to everybody else who was able to join us today. Just a reminder, all of the slides and the recording will be sent out to everybody after this. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to send them our way. So you have NEDIC's information, hopefully, but our email address is nedic@uhn.ca. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.